Welcome to another episode of She's Got Gumption. I'm Wendy J. Olson, and welcome to a new series for your summer season. Our music has been graciously provided by Brett and Emily Mills of Jesus Said Love in Waco, Texas, off their album, Never Too Far. This summer, we'll be diving into a series I like to call Things We Can't Talk About in Church. We're going in deep and having some tough conversations. Let's put on our boots and walk through this together. Let's chat. Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
I heard you on the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. Huge fan. Love it. You did a talk on your marriage. And in this series, we're talking about things we can't talk about in church, right? And instantly after I heard your talk on this, I was like, we don't talk about marriage. I mean, we do, sort of, but we don't talk about like real marriage. And you put it out there.
Oh, I had a little bit of a vulnerability hangover after that, but thank you for saying that. I wanted to present really the raw story.
Yes, I think we need that. So for people who didn't, listen to this podcast yet or whatever, or aren't familiar with who you are, can you give everyone just the 5-minute cliff notes of who you are, what you're about, what you do?
Absolutely. So I am a therapist and I'm a fellow, I would say with you, Wendy, a lover of stories. So I've been working as a counselor for about 15 years. And I remember my professor in graduate school, Jim Cofield, saying that when he is counseling someone and hearing their story, he feels like he wants to take his shoes off because he's stepping on sacred ground. And I have to say that even 15 years later, that's still been true. I just consider it such a huge privilege and honor to hear people's stories of pain and redemption. And I'm also a mother. I have 3 beautiful girls here, so I'm girl mom. And we went through infertility. So I'm 41 now, and but I have a 2-year-old. So I kind of feel like I'm middle-aged and I'm in the toddler stage.
And you're tired.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and the story of our daughters is that we actually went through IVF, and so all 3 of our daughters, this is kind of crazy fact about me, were conceived at the same time, but they were frozen. And so then they were transferred at different times. So I look at them, they actually look very similar, but my husband and I are like, they're like fraternal triplets separated at birth. Yeah. So because they were all frozen at the same time, but we have 3 little miracles, 7, 5, and 2. And the 2.5-year-old, she is kind of a miracle upon miracle upon miracle. So we called her, she was our last little, what they call a blastocyst with IVF. And so we called her like the little frosty that could. And so, yeah, like during my pregnancy with her, like my other 2 daughters, we would sing like that song, This Is My Fight song. We would kind of belt it out.
Yes.
We were like, she made it. She did it. And so, and then we named her Charlotte Louise, which means tiny fighter. But both of my husband and I are pretty tall people, so none of our babies have been tiny. So we're like, why are we naming this her tiny fighter? I mean, given that we are big into name meetings, well, turns out, so Charlotte Louise came 2 months early. We were in the NICU for 58 days, and we found out that she was born with a congenital heart defect. Wow. She had open heart surgery like the day before her due date, and very, very rare heart condition. And so she is such a miracle, and she's so full of life. She like kind of lives like she knows that she's gotten a second chance of life. And so that's a little bit of my story.
I love it. Wow. Thank you for sharing that, because that is a tiny miracle.
Absolutely. Yes. I know, we're like, okay, this is why it just, that kind of, it both haunted me and brought me comfort that we named her Tiny Fighter, in the fact of like, oh, this is like really a prophetic name for her.
Yes. I love that. I have a friend that she's struggled through infertility as well, and she is about to have her third daughter,
Oh,
and she as well is naming her Charlotte. And I was
no
like,
way.
yes.
Wow.
They not to share like too much of her story, but basically they told her that she had already had a miscarriage and she should go ahead and just take the pill and flush it
Oh.
out. And she hesitated and she waited because she didn't trust what they said. And thank God, because her little girl's due this month. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
So,
Wow.
so
What a
crazy.
beautiful story. Oh, wow. Praise God for little tiny Charlotte miracles.
Yes, yes. Well, so today we are going to be talking about things we don't talk about, right? And I don't know about you, but I grew up in church. We can sometimes be a good thing, but it can also put us at a disadvantage. And there's a difference between caught and taught. Sometimes we catch things that are not said, but understood. So I like to call these the understood but unspoken rule of things we can't talk about in church, right? And while I fully believe that the church should be a place of full disclosure, safety inside the walls, where we can truly take that sacred ground of one another's stories, right, with care and respect, I think we still come out the other side feeling like we have to be tight-lipped on some issues. And so today we're going to talk about marriage. Why is that so closely related and so personal to you in particular?
Oh, Wendy. So I am really passionate about marriage and passionate about really couples getting the opportunity to share the real struggles of marriage. I still remember when my husband and I got married, it was 2005. And, I was 26 at the time. And so, I had kind of had several friends that got married right after we graduated from college. So I wrestled with my singleness and was always just imagining what it would be like to be married. And I remember standing there, and the pastor, there was a section of the service called the Declaration of Intent. And he said, those that are choosing marriage are choosing a life of both deeper joy and deeper grief and suffering. And I thought, oh, just kind of standing there, and my 26-year-old self, like, deeper suffering, huh? And so I really have loved the words of Dan Allender, who says that marriage is a taste of heaven and a taste of hell. But I don't know that we really talk so openly about the war on marriage and how much so many of us get married and we don't realize how much our childhood wounds are taking place in the dating process, almost like this unconscious process.
It's almost like, okay, what am I getting myself into? Right? Like everybody sells the whole kid thing too. I say this all the time. Like, oh my gosh, children are a blessing. They're so wonderful until you have them. And then everybody's like, welcome to the jungle. You're going to die.
Right.
Okay. So you guys weren't honest with me. This is awful. The hardest job I've ever done is stay at home and raise these kids, But I feel like marriage is the same thing. Like,
yes,
in the church, marriage is the goal, right? Because they want to keep
right.
you from not having sex until you're married. Marriage is the goal. But then nobody talks about how hard it actually is. And we do all these, marriage retreats and, like pump up your marriage, whatever they want to call it or whatever. But on a Sunday morning, when you're talking with your friends at church and you ask, how are you doing this week? You rarely get, well, he forgot to make the bed again, or whatever's driving you crazy in that moment.
Right. Right. Or even we had a huge blowout on the way to church this morning. Or I'm really lonely. I'm longing for more connection in my marriage. Or my spouse is struggling with some type of addiction. I mean, you're right. We don't always get, or feel safe sharing the real deal of our marriage. And I love the words of, in the movie Shall We Dance of Susan Sarandon, when she says that we really long for a witness to our life. I mean, I think that's the beautiful longing in marriage, is that all of us, we feel so lonely in the world and we really want somebody to really just bear witness to the everyday tasks of our life. And yet so often there's these barriers to really seeing our spouse, really engaging in their world, really asking them the questions. I mean, my husband and I, we actually, we have a out of ground hot tub, and we try to do that some nights, because if not, we'll be looking at our screens and we'll just be both on our phones. And so we're like, how can we do something where we're not on our screens? And that's one of the things we do. We're like, okay, let's just get in the hot tub and let's just talk tonight.
I love that. That was my idea over the summer, was we need a pool in the backyard.
Yes.
Even if it's just like, the one where you fill it up with water and it fills up or whatever. But like every night after dinner, instead of sitting in front of the TV because it's too hot to go sit on the front porch, we're in North Texas where it gets to be like 110.
Yes.
So get in the pool, teach the 6-year-old how to swim, and stay off our phones for like those few hours. It won't kill us, right?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we get so caught up in logistics. I know for me and my husband, we find ourselves getting in that rut of like, all we talk about is what's happening this week.
Yes.
Right? Especially with kids or young kids, or kids, period, and then once the kids leave, you realize, oh, we have nothing to talk about.
Right. And they found, when they do research on couples, they found that couples that make it past 3 years of marriage, that one of the things that's so important is that each one of them really pursues their own interests and goals, so that when they come back, they have places to offer in the conversation. They have ways to really kind of stimulate one another and really offer, because I think the other thing that happens is we can get really bored in our marriages.
That's good, honest, feedback right there, because you're absolutely right. We can get so stale and so stagnant. And I stayed home with both my kids for the first few years, and I was reluctant to stay home with our second child because I was working and, I had a career and things were going, and I got pregnant and we moved, and I could have worked the whole time I was pregnant, but we moved, and no one's going to hire like a 6-month super overweight chick for a photography job. So plus I couldn't move or anything. And so I was so reluctant to stay home because I was like, what are we going to talk about? I don't want to talk to you about dirty diapers all the time. I don't want that to be my life,
Yes.
So you end up trying to find something else. I assume I see so many more moms doing that too. Like, let me have this side business, or let me write a blog, or just something that is not related to being a mom in the moment.
Right. And, that really helps with the fallacy that our spouse can really meet all of our needs and our interests. I mean, I know that you did a podcast on the Enneagram, and I'm a huge fan of the Enneagram. I feel like it's been transformational. And sometimes I just remind myself, my husband is one number, on the Enneagram, and I'm one number, and I have a desire to connect with all different numbers on the Enneagram, men and women. And so really giving ourselves some freedom to say that we are complex, beautifully made people, and that we have created in the image of God, and we have so much complexity, more than what one person can really bear on our behalf. And so I think that that's so important to have interest outside of the marriage.
You and your husband are both therapists, right?
We are.
Okay.
Yes.
My biggest question I've been chewing on for like a week since you said you do this was, and I don't have a word for it, so I made up a word. Do you guys, when you're having a disagreement or whatever, therapize each other?
I knew that word was coming. That's so great. Like, she's going to ask if we're therapized. If I'm totally honest, we have our moments where I'll say, your mother issues are coming out, or like, this isn't about me, this is about this, but so we do have the tendency to do that, but we really tend to, and this is I think so close to my heart, is that Michael is the person that I have deemed safe in the world. And
Mm.
so, really my kind of most, I think most places in my world, I have this certain filter that I use and I choose, when I'm
Yes.
vulnerable. But I would say so much of my interactions with him, it's like it comes from this kind of deep guttural place. And so I would say actually, we don't therapize as often as we should. We should use more tools that we use when we're counseling. But I spoke about this in the other podcast. One of the things, I mean, honestly, Wendy, this has saved us. It really has saved us. We've already done it maybe 2 times this weekend. Is we do a 3 minutes, and so when we're having an argument, we just stop, and one of us will say, "I need a 3 minutes." And we basically just look at one another and we try to really listen to what the person is saying, feeling. And then the best, I think the best line is once you finish, the other person repeats it back to you. And then they say, "Is there anything else? Is there
Mm.
anything else?" And you really get this sense of like, I'm going to get to keep talking until I really sense that I'm heard. And then the other fabulous part of this is you don't have to agree fully, but you have to really listen and you have to really get inside the other person. And so it's so practical, but we do this so often. I mean, we really do. It's just so helpful to us. And our kids know it. And we've started trying to do it with them, because when we're kind of in that, what I would call the word flooded,
Mm.
when it's like your brain, the language center of your brain, your prefrontal cortex, the cognitive kind of rational part of your brain is shut down. And
Yes.
you feel, I'm not being heard, I'm angry, you're not for me. I feel that a lot. Like, you don't care about me, you're not
Yes.
for me. And so when that happens, it's like there's something about being heard that regulates my body and soothes it to the point that we can kind of continue in our discussion. So helpful.
And am I right in saying this? It releases some kind of hormone or something once you feel seen and heard.
Absolutely. If we did a brain scan, if we were looking at our brains, you would see that kind of what we call like the hot center of the brain, or the amygdala, that is lit up. When the brain is
Mm.
lit up or flooded or triggered, and then all of a sudden you would literally watch the brain calm down, when you're understood in what we would call like early attachment. And we know that our early attachment is related to marriage, in that oxytocin, which is that same, hormone that's released when a mother is breastfeeding her baby,
Mhm.
or like when you first have that infant, that's the same hormone that comes out in like sexual intimacy. So we
Mhm.
know that early attachment is so closely related, that pleasure center, to our marriages. And so I just think that it's just so important that we create this awareness, of that connection. I think the language of attachment has helped us so much, and it's helped couples that we've both worked with. One book that I would highly recommend is called How We Love. It's by
Mm.
Kay and Milan Yurkovich, and they have written this fabulous book. They have tons of support material. So if you check out their website at How We Love, I think it's howwelove.com maybe. But they really look at early attachment and how it relates to marriage. And then they have so they have the pleaser, avoider, vacillator, controller, and victim. And they
Mm.
look at
Okay.
how that's shaped in early childhood in our family of origin, and then how that plays out in marriages. And then they have information on the different combinations. So my husband and I, we have a vacillator, and I'm a vacillator and he's an avoider. And so it's such a helpful book.
I've heard of that before. I was trying to pinpoint like, oh, I know that name. I've heard it somewhere. Um, but yeah, I've heard several people recommend that. I think that's an important book to put on my list. I just finished The Body Keeps the Score, so I'm
Oh, yes.
fascinated by all of that stuff. But for people who aren't familiar with attachment style, can you give them just the brief rundown of what that is? And then maybe we can talk about how that works in marriages.
Yes. So attachment theory, kind of the basic idea is that an infant needs to develop a relationship with at least one primary caregiver for social and emotional development to occur normally. So when you look at your baby and you're making eye contact, you're mirroring them. Literally, little neurons are forming in their brain. So there's a if you want to Google, if the listeners want to Google still face experiment, there was an experiment called the Strange Experiment where they looked at children at 1 year of age, and they looked at what would happen when a mother left and then returned. And so what they found is that some children would become that we would consider securely attached. They felt distressed when the mother left, but when the mother came back, that they were able to be soothed. And so there was like essentially an attachment repair, what we would call an attachment repair. There was a rupture and repair. But then some of the children, once the mother came back, they felt a level of anger at the mother, a level of distrust that the mother had left. And then another category of kids, you wouldn't naturally know that the mother had left, that they would be considered more avoidant attachment, and then didn't show a lot of emotional reactivity when the mother returned. And so that kind of started looking the research on this idea of early attachment. And then there was an amazing study that was done by two researchers called Haven and Schreiber. Mm-hmm. And they looked at, this is so interesting to me, the relationship between infant caregivers and romantic relationships. And they found that in both relationships, you feel safe when the other is nearby and responsive, that you both engage in close, intimate bodily contact, that you both feel insecure when the other is inaccessible, you both share discoveries with one another, you both play with one another's facial features and exhibit mutual fascination with one another, and that you both engage in baby talk. And so they really found these connections. And so, so then, there's been several books and research studies that have really looked at if we can understand our own early attachment style, that it gives us tremendous categories for how we interact in our marriage and how we do intimate relationship, because scripture talks about that you'll leave your mother and father and cling to your spouse. So we know that the two most formative experiences are both our birth experience, who our parents were, who the characters were at our birth, and then who we marry. Just hands down, those are just the most significant formative relationships.
Do you believe, or have you seen where I imagine two insecurely attached people find each other pretty easily, right? Because you're both missing something, you're looking for something, it makes sense that you're in a marriage together. Have you ever seen where someone is securely attached but married to someone that is insecurely attached?
Well, first of all, I will say absolutely with the insecure attachment, because yes, there is a sense really, that we find someone to kind of complete, or what I would say, move the immovable object. So take the thing that I didn't get as a child and then recreate some system that kind of reenacts some of that, and then ultimately kind of get the love that I never got. I think though, I try to use attachment categories when they're helpful. But we do know that it just takes 40% attunement to create secure attachment. And so I want to just say that for all the parents out there. So there really are a lot of securely attached people walking around in the world.
Yeah.
And
none of them are on this podcast right now, but
awesome. But what I would say about that is that I think there are securely attached people walking around, but nobody has escaped the fall.
Right.
So no matter whether you're securely attached or insecurely attached, I think that it is important to note how how intimacy has been shaped and how that plays out. Because oftentimes I'll have a couple come in where both of them are sort of identifying one particular person as the problem. They might say, I'm the problem. Their spouse might say they're the problem. And one will say, well, I came from a good family. And then the other person will say, yes, I have so much trauma in my background. I know I bring so much to the marriage. But as we poke around, we find that even the securely attached person has a certain pattern that has kind of come into the marriage. So I think it's really important that while I do see secure attached people married to insecurely attached people, that even nobody's come unscathed completely. And so I still want everyone to live with a certain level of curiosity when it comes to their own marriages. And I think it can be really hard and painful if you're the one in the marriage that has kind of been identified as, this is the person that brings the most trauma or brings the most unhealthy style of relating. I mean, that can be really wounding. So it's really helpful when the other person can kind of be curious about their style of relating.
And I think, at least in our marriage, it's very healthy for us to realize that we both need to clean up our side of the street. We both bring in our issues. We're both insecurely attached. People, like you said, no one gets through this unscathed, right? Whether it's big T trauma or little T trauma,
right?
You've lived in this world long enough, you have scars.
Right. Absolutely. And to be curious about both of those, the little T's and the big T's, and ultimately kind of what you saw in the other person. Because even if we look at like Enneagram language, I mean, we each sort of find like a counterpoint of ourselves in some way. So there's something of my husband that I found. I mean, even in the most, today he actually asked me, he said, do you feel envious of my attention to detail, of my, and it actually is true, to be honest. I mean, and he was picking up on that because I was sort of, there was this way that I was kind of contempting him. And I had to ask his forgiveness for this, but he's an Enneagram 1. He's a marathon runner. He's like qualified for the Boston Marathon. I mean, he exceeds in so many areas that I don't. And so there can be this way that when I talk about his deep goodness, the best parts about him, that sometimes I just look at him in awe and wonder, and other times there's a slight contempt. There's a slight envy and sometimes it's not so slight, honestly. And so he really just asked me about that today, because there was something about our Saturday morning routine, and he had felt that from me. And I said, you're right, I do. And so again, just being curious about, how did you find this other person? What was it that you were attracted to in both the glorious beauty and redemption, as well as, just acknowledging kind of the darkness in our own souls, that sometimes we want to shoot arrows at one another. It's hard.
I love that. Shoot arrows at one another. That's so true. My husband knows me really well, and we were having a big fight like a couple weeks ago or whatever. And he was like, you're being mean because that's your defense mechanism. And I was like, yes, but you have to know my style of mean, and that will show you at what level of anger I'm at.
Yes.
Like when I'm really quiet, but my words feel like they're stabbing you through the heart, you're on the other side of super messed up, dude.
Yes.
But
yes.
I'm self-aware enough to know that's exactly what I'm doing.
Right.
I'm not unaware. I know exactly what I've done this before. I'm 38 years old. Come on now.
Right. And even, yes, but I think even having compassion on Wendy, like there is this place that I think can be such a beautiful place to say, wow, there are places in my life, in my story, where this was the only protection that I had.
Right.
But I don't need that same kind of protection now that I once did. And I think we've had to really look at that with one another. another Milan Yurkovich always says to get a PhD in how your spouse was wounded.
Yes.
And I just think that's brilliant, because it's
that.
like just to really understand each other's stories to the best that we can, so that we can even have categories. I mean, sometimes my husband will just look at me with this really kind, like, what is it that you're needing from me right now? Because it's just, he sees this little dysregulated little girl, and I'm like, oh, just like, yes, you're right. This is, sometimes I'm like, I just want to like beat your chest right now. Like,
yes.
uh
We've done that recently too, where like we started going back to counseling again. And so like we're using these tools, right? But like sometimes you get the eye roll of you're using the when I feel, whatever statement.
Yes.
But we're like, no, we're not going to do that. These are the tools that we're supposed to use, and they're like at the basic, of what counseling is. But yeah, when you're caught, when your spouse calls you to the carpet, you're like,
right.
Why do you know me so well? This is only going to get harder the longer we're married.
That's both the taste of heaven and the taste of hell right there. It's like somebody bearing witness to my life like nobody else, but then also someone exposing and seeing me in this really, really vulnerable spot. Oh,
it's that dream where you go to school and you're naked all over again.
Yes.
I just love that you share and that you're vulnerable about your own marriage. And I sometimes I sense a real shame around people that feel like there's shame surrounding marriage counseling. I feel like we need to check in every few months, especially when we've gone off the rails a little bit, not when we're completely indestructive, blow up, Chernobyl mode, but when we're sensing distance. We need to put our alarms on and come back full center. Can you speak to that at all? I mean, do you feel like there is shame surrounding couples that should go or do want to go to marriage counseling?
That's such a great question, Wendy. I think there's less shame than there ever has been. I mean, I'm always amazed that there's certain couples that come in that say, we want more. We really want more. And it's just beautiful. I mean, I love that. Or we have this demilitarized zone in our marriage that we're just not, whether it be sex or money or in-law relationships, that we just can't get past. And I love that. And then you have other couples that come in crisis. And then I think you have couples that have this whole hidden dynamic that's going on that they have not felt safe to talk to anybody about. And they take this incredible risk to come in and come out of hiding, and it's just like, wow. I mean, again, that's where I just feel like it's such holy space. But my husband and I, we just did like I'm trying to think if we did like 12 hours. We just did a marriage intensive with one of our favorite therapists, and it was so good for our marriage. Like, we were like, this is so good. We might as well spend this money than spend a money on, like, I hope we will go someplace for our anniversary, but I'm like, oh, this is so good, and it's so rich.
It's worth it. It's an investment. You should invest in your marriage. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yes, it is. It's so worth it. And people spend money on taking their kids to therapy. But it's like so much. I did hear a quote once. It's like, your kids need to know that you love each other even more than they need to know they're loved. And I think there's something so important about that, to really invest in your marriage. It's so, so important. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of marriage counseling. I know there is some shame associated with it, but I'm hoping that that's starting to loosen a bit.
Yeah.
And really thanks to people like you, Wendy, that would do a podcast on this. I mean, really, I really appreciate that, because I think that just takes a little bit of shame away from it.
I loved, hearing you talk about your marriage. And I think we have these preconceived notions that, oh, well, they're therapists, so they know what they're doing. Oh no, they're still humans. Their marriage still has issues too. And two completely different humans.
Right. And a lot of us go into the field to try to figure out our own stories and our own trauma.
Yes.
But it does create, it has helped me when I see courageous couples come in my office. It helps me to be more courageous in my own marriage. I mean, it's just true.
I love it. Well, wrapping up our conversation for today, what is the one thing that you would tell people within the church that they should talk about or questions ask about marriage?
Again, this may be a little bit repetitive, but I think the idea of being curious about one another's stories. I mean, I think that we sleep next to someone every night who is a wealth of untold stories.
Yes.
I mean, my husband writes, for his own kind of therapeutic process. And sometimes he tells a story and I'm like, I've never known that story before. And I will write a story and I've never shared that story with him before. And so with each story, it's like the most beautiful mining,
Yes.
It's like mining in the dirt, but there is like treasure there. And so I think the more that we're curious, I mean, that takes a lot of the boredom of marriage away. Right. And then I think ultimately to really hold that there is a war on marriage happening, that when Michael and I are about to speak at a marriage conference or, we will just get so attacked by the enemy.
Absolutely.
I mean, we might be fighting on the plane there, fighting the night before, it's just to just really remember that there is an enemy. And then ultimately, just the beauty of being able to take that step to let somebody in. And it could be a therapist, but it also could be a friend from church. It also could be a pastor. It could be whoever that, kind of in that Brene Brown term of like someone that you consider safe. And that's usually somebody that's more open about their own life, just to say, hey, I just want to let you know this is happening, or I want more, or I'm really hurting right now, or we have some trauma that we've never worked through here.
I mean, like you had said earlier, sometimes it's so lonely and isolating because you feel like you can't talk about it. And then when you open up and do talk about it, you may get the reciprocal of that person being like, hey, I've been there too. I'm there right now. And how comforting is that to know that you're not alone?
Right. Absolutely.
Thank you again, Rachel, for doing this and for sharing your heart and just being who you are out in the world, following your purpose and passion that that God gave you. It's beautiful and I love it.
Thank you so much for having me, Wendy. It's been an honor.
I have the professor's quote about people's stories being sacred ground so much over the last few weeks, and I encourage you to do the same. It's when we're invited into those safe spaces that we make room for others and their vulnerability, therefore snuffing out the silent epidemic of shame. Marriage is something that is talked about a lot in church, but not the real vulnerable truth of the epidemic of loneliness in many couples' lives. Living in silence only adds to this shame, and we must break out of these cardboard boxes of everything is just fine and actually share our struggles with safe people. If you don't have a safe person, find one. Or find a therapist who can help you walk along this journey. There are lots of free resources out there, as well as podcasts, inexpensive workshops, and books. Be sure to pray for your partner, even when it's really hard and even when all you have are a handful of words and 3 of those contain 4 letters. Thank you again for tuning into this series called Things We Can't Talk About in Church. My hope is that this helps open more uncomfortable conversations and leads you to live a life of vulnerability and honesty. I posted links on the show notes of where to get hooked up with Rachel and the link for the Place We Find Ourselves podcast that I referred to in this episode. If you want to catch up with me in between podcast episodes, you can always find me on Instagram at MRS Mrs. Wendy J. Olson, OLSON. I'm also doing a blog series of the same name, Things We Can't Talk About in Church, on other subjects as well. My website is wendyjolson.com. Remember, that's OLSON. Thanks again for listening. We hope you're enjoying this summer series as much as we are. Make sure you subscribe, and if you haven't already, we'd love it if you take a minute and leave us a review. We love 5 stars. Tell us what you're loving. See y'all back next week.